Hi, I'm Rob Carolina. This is one part of a multi-part introduction to the Law and Regulation Knowledge Area of CyBOK. The Law and Regulation Knowledge Area is one of 19 knowledge areas in the entire project. The webinar that introduces this knowledge area is pretty long, and so I decided to break it up into 15 constituent parts. You are now about to listen to one of those parts. If you haven't already done so, I would recommend that you go back and listen to the introduction. It's also labeled Part 0. That'll help you understand what's about to happen. Alternatively, you can listen to the entire webinar as a single file. So without further ado, let's listen to this part. And now we turn to a discussion of ethics. Why should cybersecurity practitioners adhere to some sort of code of conduct? What is the case for a code of conduct? Why is this a good idea? Why should we have them? First of all, cybersecurity practitioners are often placed into positions of trust. They're given preferential access or administrative access or root access to sensitive systems, business systems, and government systems. The activities of cybersecurity practitioners often take place behind closed doors, out of the glare of public scrutiny. Cybersecurity practitioners are working with a set of special knowledge and special skills. All of these factors tend to suggest that a practitioner could have asymmetric power in a client relationship. It could be that all of these other points about acting outside public scrutiny with special knowledge and skills placed in a position of trust gives them unwarranted power over their client. And finally, people with these skills, whether they're acting as consultants or information security officers or operational folks or conducting research, there's a lot of potential that their actions could result in harm to members of the public. You put all 5 of these points together, and this is a classic formulation that says this is a function that should be subject to some type of agreed code of conduct, some type of agreed code of ethics. That's a challenge because, to be candid, there aren't very many out there. What is it that we should have in a code of conduct? What is it that makes a code a good code? Well, in my opinion, first of all, a good code of conduct would have detailed guidance on how to interpret and apply the principles that are expressed in a code of conduct. It's one thing to put up high-minded principles, it's another thing to know how to apply them. A good code of conduct should address the relationship between a practitioner and their client, as well as between the practitioner and society as a whole, and try to give some guidance on how to balance these two relationships. These can be put in tension, and a lot of practitioners regularly face tension between what they believe is their obligation to society and what they believe is their obligation to a client. And when that relationship is examined, remember this: we want clients to be able to trust cybersecurity practitioners. And how do we facilitate that trust? Third, what makes a good code of conduct? Adoption and support by a well-defined community of practitioners. If a code of conduct is simply written by 3 or 4 experts and published without any kind of debate, I think that the resulting code will not be well respected and will not be taken up particularly strongly. What makes a code particularly strong is if there are many voices involved in the debate and the people in the field themselves are involved in helping to set the standards. Now, examples that I believe are worthy of study that I've cited are the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. These were significantly changed or revised in 2018, and that revision process took some time. I like the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct because it's built around a community of people who have similar skills, people who work in computing. And it's a fascinating examination because the 2018 Code of Ethics talks extensively about ethics in the cyber age. The preceding code from the early 1992 barely mentions the internet at all. A very different code of conduct can be found with CREST, and I mentioned this in CyBOK as well. The CREST Code of Conduct is built around a community of people delivering a similar business process or a similar business service. Specifically, the CREST Code began with a group of people who were delivering penetration testing services, and they've now grown along a number of business service lines. So the two codes are interesting because they have different design ideals, or they are designed for different types of community. The first is a community based around technical expertise, and the second is a community, although reliant on technical expertise, that's built around similar business process. I think it's really hard to talk about ethics in cybersecurity without mentioning vulnerability testing and disclosure. When we look at vulnerability testing, there is unfortunately a lack of consensus on how to tell the difference between research and computer crime. Now, I know that not everyone's going to agree with that, but if you want to see some evidence of it, how is it that we routinely talk about white hat, black hat, and then worst of all, gray hat hackers? The very names themselves suggest that we're finding it difficult to understand what is appropriate or inappropriate research methodology. And even when you get to sort of the ivory tower of the academy of higher education, you sometimes stumble into situations where people arguably get the calculation wrong. It's very, very difficult. Secondly, vulnerability disclosure. This is where a lot of the shooting and a lot of the fighting happens, frankly. There's a lack of practitioner consensus on the process of responsible disclosure. There's also lack of consensus on whether or not disclosure should be held off indefinitely, which is to say, should something not be disclosed. There's a lot of ongoing discussion and argument about state security agencies, the ones who talk about balancing equities, responsible release, etc., and I've cited some of these in CyBOK. Finally, there's a lot of differing practice on how to deal with the subject of bug bounties, people who want to monetize vulnerability. Slowly, some consensus seems to be building around the value of a bug bounty program, but then there's a lot of cases where you just are trying to figure out what's the appropriate thing to do. The difference between a researcher who offers a vulnerability because they've found it to somebody who has a published bug bounty program and says, I'd like my bounty, please, as opposed to somebody who goes to an organization that doesn't have one and says, oh, I've found a vulnerability, and wouldn't it be nice if you gave me a lot of money to disclose it to you? There's a very, very uncomfortable boundary between legitimate research and responding to requests for bugs and, well, just a shakedown. Finally, don't overlook the last point. Vendor action, vendor responsibility. One of the most frustrating things about vulnerability disclosure is when disclosures are made to vendors and then they do nothing. They should do something. In fact, there seems to be industry consensus on what they should do. You can find it in these two ISO standards that talk about how to set up a process for receiving vulnerability reports, just being made aware of vulnerabilities, and then how to action a vulnerability. Unfortunately, although there appears to be some consensus in these two ISO standards, there's lack of implementation across the board in the vendor community. Finally,